Why is it so hard to find football boots that actually fit, and what can you do about it? It might be one of the worst feelings when you order a new pair of football boots, they come in through the mail, you get them out of the box, and once you try them on, they're just disappointing. The toe box might be too narrow, they may pinch different parts of your feet, and your heel might be slipping all over the place. The good news is, it's not your fault, it's actually more often than not the fault of the company making the boots. But thankfully, there are a few tips you can use to make sure you get a better fit when you order your next pair. And that's exactly what we're going to be covering in this video. So sit back, relax, and let's talk about what you can do to actually get a comfortable pair of boots. And everything is going to start with the first and maybe most important factor, and that's going to be the shape. So the first thing to know is that different brands like Nike, Adidas, New Balance, Mizuno, and more are all going to have a different shape to their football boots. And not only are different brands going to have different shapes to one another, but sometimes even within these brands, different models are also going to have different shapes. So a Tiempo from Nike isn't going to fit exactly the same as a Phantom GX2, and a Mercurial isn't going to fit the same way as the Premier 3. And these differences basically come from different lasts, and lasts are molds that companies use when shaping their football boots. And while generally when you look from afar, the different shapes may seem pretty similar, when you look closely, you can see that there are subtle differences between brands like Adidas and say New Balance that I have here in terms of how they shape their boots, especially when you look towards the toe box area. This is actually even more apparent when you grab a wide version from New Balance that I have here and compare it to the Adidas F50 that we were just looking at. You can clearly see that there's a lot more volume and space in the toe box with the boots that I have here. Now, most boots are going to fit pretty snug throughout the midfoot, but the toe box is a really important area to determine if the boots are going to be comfortable for you. And in my opinion, the best thing to do is just to try out some different boots from different brands and get a sense for what works best for you. Because everyone's foot is going to have a slightly different shape, and what works well for some players isn't going to work well for others. And these really small differences in the shape of your boots is why some players might gravitate towards a brand like Nike and others might be pushed towards something like Adidas. I personally think that some brands like New Balance, Mizuno, and Asics are going to be a little bit better for those with wider feet, and if you want a more comprehensive list of boots that are good for wide-footed players, I'll leave that in the description below. But the most important thing you should be looking for when it comes to the shape of your boots when you try them on is that your toes should not be pinched in any area when you first get the boots on feet. Because I can promise you, if the boots feel a little bit uncomfortable when you try them on for the first time, they're only going to be more uncomfortable when you actually go to play in them. Next up, the second most important factor you should be looking for when trying on a new pair of boots, and that's going to be lockdown. Now, while the shape of your boots is likely going to dictate how comfortable they are, the lockdown is going to dictate whether or not they actually perform well. And essentially, what lockdown is when it comes to football boots is how well your heel and ankle remain in place while moving in the football boots. And if you've ever tried on boots that have bad lockdown, you're definitely going to know it because your heel is going to be slipping all over the place. You're going to be more likely to get blisters at the back of your foot, and they may be painful or loose towards the ankle area. Essentially, lockdown all comes down to how secure the boots feel when they're on feet. And there are a few different factors that can dictate how the lockdown is in your boots, but I would say maybe the biggest is just the depth of the heel area. When you try your boots on for the first time, you want to feel like your feet are comfortably sitting in the boots, and you don't want to feel that your heel is too shallow. You'd be surprised how many boots currently on the market have this issue in terms of not offering enough lockdown, and it can be especially common with boots under the $100 price point. In fact, it did used to be an issue with a lot of Adidas takedown models, especially the third tier ones that are around 80 to 90 bucks, but thankfully in recent years, they have fixed it in their newest generation. So when you do try on a pair of boots for the first time, make sure you walk around in them, maybe even go for a light jog if you can, and make sure your heel isn't slipping throughout the back of the boots. Next up, the third factor that's going to affect the fit of your boots is actually going to be the sole plate. Now, you may think the only reason the sole plates are there on your boots is to give you more traction on the pitch, but they are also going to affect how your boots fit. And I find some of the discourse around sole plates to be a little bit interesting because a lot of brands and some players seem to think that the stiffer the sole plate, the better. But ultimately, I don't think that that's true. Now, obviously, you can have a sole plate that's too soft because that would just result in stud pressure, because almost any pair of boots is going to have relatively long conical or bladed studs. And if the sole plate was too soft, you would just just end up feeling the pressure from those studs coming through the insole. But you also have to remember that your foot is not a rigid structure. Your feet have so many smaller bones and muscles, and they're capable of flexing in a variety of directions. And for that reason, you don't actually want a sole plate that is completely rigid and incapable of flexion. And that's why, in my experience, when I've used boots that have a really rigid sole plate, they can actually cause some fatigue in my feet over time. In fact, when I look at one of my favorite pairs of boots of the year, this is the Adler Horenzo, you can see just how much I can bend it without really even applying that much force. The sole plate is relatively capable of both flexion and torsion. But then when I compare it to something like the Vapor 16 Pro from Nike that I have here, it's gonna be much harder to bend. I'm only able to get just a little bit of flexion towards the toe box. Now, I should note that as you get a new pair of boots and you break them in over a few weeks and months, the sole plate will get a little bit more flexible. And generally, the bare minimum that you're gonna wanna look for in terms of sole plate flexion is that they bend just behind the toe box, which is pretty much right here around this area, because that's where your feet are gonna be bending when you're running. And to show you an example of poor sole plate design, this is a pair of Umbros that I have here. And literally, if I grab the boots from the top and the bottom and pull them apart, it's almost only the heel area that seems to move back and forth, whereas conversely, the forefoot and the toe box is extremely rigid. So ultimately, this design here just isn't very anatomical, and it's not gonna do a good job of moving well with your feet. So as far as sole plates go, make sure when you try on your boots, they don't feel too constraining as you're walking around, but make sure you also don't feel any stud pressure coming through the bottom of the insoles. And the fourth feature we have on our list is going to be the lacing system. Now, there are really only two different lacing systems that you need to be aware of, and one is going to be the one-piece upper design, and the other is going to be the U-throat open lacing system. Now, the U-throat design is going to be what I think most people are familiar with. This is pretty much the classic original structure of not just football boots, but pretty much any sneaker. And it's called a U-throat design because it kind of carves the upper into this U shape, and it's going to have a traditional simple tongue in the center. And one of the best things about a traditional U-throat design is that it's going to allow for some level of adjustability. You're going to be able to, say, tighten it a little bit towards the base here near the toe box, and maybe leave it a little bit more loose or open towards the ankle area. It also, I think, makes the boots a little bit more adaptable in terms of sizing. So say you end up getting a boot that just is maybe a fraction too big for you, maybe it's a half size up, maybe you get a 10.5 when it would have been better to get a 10. You can basically use a lacing system like this to make sure the boots still give you enough lockdown and comfort, and so that your feet are going to be able to be secure inside the boots. That being said, it may take a little bit of tinkering and messing around to lace them up in a way that's going to work best for you. And then the other most popular lacing system that you see a lot in modern football boots is going to be this one-piece upper design. Now, in a sense, a lot of one-piece upper football boots barely need laces in the first place because they're actually a continuous design with really elasticated, stretchy knit material running through the center of the boots. So these boots with a one-piece upper actually fit really snug and close to your feet without any laces to begin with, and really the laces are just woven through the football boots to give you a little bit more lockdown and security, especially towards the ankle area. Now, in terms of fit, boots with this one-piece upper design are going to have a little bit more consistency. In other words, the laces are going to have slightly less of an impact in terms of the fit of the overall boots. And then the downside to that is that a one-piece upper boot is going to have a little less adjustability than you would get from a more traditional lacing system. Now, at the end of the day, one of these isn't necessarily going to be better than the other. It really just comes down to personal preference. You really just want to make sure that whichever lacing system you go for, you're able to get enough security and comfort around both the midfoot and the ankle area. And then finally, the last feature you want to be paying attention to when buying your next pair of football boots is going to be material. Now, to break football boot materials down into three main categories, you are going to have leather, followed by synthetic, and then knit. And once again, all of these different material types can be good as long as they're executed on correctly. So I would take a well-designed synthetic football boot over a poorly designed leather boot and vice versa. But there are some small advantages and disadvantages to these material types that you should know about. So one key benefit to leather boots, which is one reason I like them a lot, is because especially towards the toe box area, they are going to stretch and mold to your feet as you wear them over time. I also think that some leather boots, especially more premium leather football boots, are going to offer you a slightly more natural and clean touch on the ball. But that's another aspect that may ultimately come down to personal preference. Now, one slight con of leather football boots is that if you play in the rain, they are likely to get a little bit heavier on feet and they can become waterlogged, whereas if you're dealing with thinner synthetic football boots or knit football boots, they're so much thinner and they're just going to do a better job at not retaining as much water. And the cool thing is these days you can even find boots that have a combination of all of these different material types. This is the Mizuno Morelia Neo 4 Beta. It's going to have leather in the toe box that's really soft and premium. It's going to have a stretchy knit material running through the midfoot, and then at the sides of the boot here, you're going to have a razor thin synthetic material. Now, regardless of the material type you choose, to actually get the benefits of the boot you're playing with, you want to make sure that the material isn't too bulky. Because regardless of the material that's on the outside of the upper here, if the boots are really thick and heavily lined on the inside, you're just not going to really notice. In other words, a really bulky leather boot is pretty much going to give you a similar sensation to a really bulky synthetic boot. Now, when I was younger, you usually had to spend a little bit more money to get a more premium pair of boots that had a thinner and more responsive upper, but these days you can actually spend less than $100 because a lot of the more affordable takedowns have relatively thin uppers that are going to offer you a ton of sensitivity on the ball. And guys, that is pretty much going to do it for this video. Those are the 5 factors you should look out for when choosing your next pair of boots. And as always, if you can, it's great to try on some boots in store to figure out what works best for you. And thankfully these days, if you do order a pair online, if they really don't feel good out of the box, you can always return them and get something else. And as I mentioned in the description of this video, I'll do my best to leave some of my favorite football boot recommendations if you are looking to pick something up. There's also going to be some discount codes that you can use as well that can help you get 10% off. If you found this video helpful and you want some more football related content, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.